Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm tremendously honored and thrilled to be here. It's really, truly impressive to see on a Saturday morning at 9:30 a room packed to capacity, ready and excited and willing to talk about groundwater management. I've been to literally hundreds of other places in the state of California to talk about groundwater management, and I have not seen a turnout anywhere close to this. So you should be pretty excited about what you see going on here today. I want to talk a little bit about water management in an uncertain future. And I'm going to talk about what those uncertainties are, what they mean for you and what they mean for how you manage your water. I'm going to key in on three specific things. First, we're going to talk about water supply uncertainty, and I'm going to make the argument that water supply uncertainty is really driven by three things. It's driven by population change, it's driven by land use change, and it's driven by climate change. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of those going forward. We'll talk a little bit about water rights and groundwater. How do they intersect, and how does that intersect with those water supply uncertainties on top of that? And then lastly, I'll kind of end with maybe a little bit of a rant about value-based management options. What does value-based management options mean? It means two things. It means how much money you're willing to pay for something, but it also means what you value as a community. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So first off, let's focus in on those water supply uncertainties. This is a graph that shows California's population from about 1900 to 2016. You can see the little corner down here. We're at about maybe 2 million in the entire state. And as of 2016, we were pretty close to 40 million. I think now we're maybe a little bit over 40 million. So you can imagine that the water needs for a state of 2 million are considerably different than the water needs for a state of 40 million. And if we look at where we have last invested as kind of an entire state in our water supply portfolio, the last kind of keystone piece of the state water project was put in 1968. That was when Oroville Dam was completed. We had a population of about 18 million people. Now that's not to say that there haven't been other supply projects since then. There have been other big reservoirs that have gone in since then. New Melones went in on the Stanislaus River in 1979. There have been a lot of investments in kind of local integrated water management projects, groundwater banking projects. But collectively, that's not the same as a reservoir of 3.5 million acre feet. Now, this isn't an argument to say, let's put in more reservoirs. We put in the reservoirs where we actually have a reasonable chance of collecting that water, where there's not a giant fault that runs directly under the proposed reservoir location. We want to pay attention to those kind of things. So you know, we've kind of tapped out our reservoirs. There's over 55 major reservoirs that can store over 1 million acre feet of water. That's a tremendous amount of water that we can already store. But the main thing to point out is that, you know, that's the linchpin of the state water project, and our population has grown by 20 million people since then. So we're going to have to start thinking about what happens in another 20 years when our population increases by another 10 or 20 million people. By 2050, we could be at 60 million people in the state of California. Where is that water going to come from? Another forcing factor is land use change. So it's a little bit hard to see, but this, let's see if I can get the dot, this little star right here, that's the location of the state capitol in Sacramento. And you can see the Sacramento River kind of coming down from the north. The American River comes in from the south, or from the east rather. The main thing to look at is the colors. The pink color is urban, and then the kind of tannish color is agriculture. And everything other than that is forest. It looks like there was a forest in downtown Sacramento in 1920. There was floodplain, there was riparian habitat. Let's fast forward to 2011. Things have changed. It's not just in the Central Valley. This is universal across most of California. The rapid expansion of urban sectors, so new housing, commercial districts, industrial districts, but also agriculture. If you go to the Central Valley, if you go to the Salinas Valley, if you go to parts of Santa Cruz County down by Watsonville, you've seen just a tremendous expansion of agriculture. You are still seeing that expansion of agriculture, although it looks a little bit different. It's a plant now with 5 or 6 leaves, and it's kind of spiky on the end. There's a tremendous use of land for cannabis cultivation. It's still expanding, and California is still wrestling with the outcomes of that use of land for cannabis cultivation. The third thing is climate change. So this is a picture of the Sierra Nevada. You can see Lake Tahoe in the upper part. That's Mono Lake down in the kind of greenish part. Note that in 2011, Mono Lake turned green, and we're not really sure why. It's not green anymore. It changed back. But you can see there was a lot of snow in the Sierra Nevada. The snow is our major reservoir. It still supplies over 50% of our annual water supply to the entire state. As many of you are aware, we went through a tremendous drought from 2013 through 2016. What did that look like? Well, in spring of 2014, our snowpack was 34% of average. In spring of 2015, it was 5% of average. Based on kind of tree ring reconstructions, and we may hear about this later on, this is probably the severest drought in anywhere from 500 to 1300 years, perhaps the severest 3-year period of drought in an equal amount of time. And it may reflect what we see in the future as climate change further manifests. What we're likely to see is droutier droughts, that's not actually a word, but longer, hotter droughts that are more severe, and then punctuated by periods of intense precipitation and intense rainfall, kind of like what we saw in 2016, 2017. The kind of interesting tweak to that is that punctuated period of precipitation probably won't come as snow. It will come as rain, and our reservoir and water capture systems, at least in most of California, are not plumbed to capture heavy rainpour or heavy downfalls of rain. They're kind of constructed to slowly capture snow melt runoff over time. California is not immune to drought also. You can see this is a complicated graph, goes back to about 1895 on the bottom. It's something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's basically a measure of how severe was your drought. And if you're below that red line, you have a pretty severe drought. And you can see that the drought we had in 2014 and 2015 was really severe. We can expect to see more of these, but at the same time, it's not like we weren't expecting drought, right? We have a drought kind of every summer. It stops raining sometimes in April, and then it doesn't start again until December or January. We're kind of plumbed to deal with that, but we're not plumbed to deal with that year after year after year. So those are kind of the three forcing mechanisms. I want to turn kind of an abrupt transition then and talk about water rights law. How does water rights help California deal with those three forcing mechanisms I just described? Well, basically it lays out a system and a set of protocols and rules by which people can use water throughout the entire state. And we need that series of systems and rules because, as I mentioned, we have a drought every year, right? It stops raining and our streams slowly trickle away and they slowly dry up until it rains again. And you can imagine where if it was a free-for-all for anybody, that somebody just comes in, they put in a dam, and all of a sudden there's no water for anybody downstream. There's no water for the environment, for fish, or whatever ecosystems that depend on that water. So it's in our own best interest as a state to really tightly manage this system. And so there was a question earlier, whose water is it? It is your water, but it's also my water. I live up in Sacramento. It's also Dave Sepos's water. He lives up in Sacramento too. The water belongs to the people of the state of California. That means a water right is a usufruct right, or usufructory. That's a fantastic word. You can use it the next time you talk to your friends, and you can see their eyes glaze over as you talk. But that basically means that you have a right to use the water. The right, you don't own the water itself. You don't get to control the water itself, but you get to use the water, and you have a very strong right to use that water. The use of that water and the right to use that water is so strongly ingrained in California water law and the Constitution. It's right there in the Constitution, Article 10, Section 2. It's also all throughout the Water Code, which basically states that if you're going to use water, you have to use it beneficially. And that beneficial use has to make sense. You just can't make something up and say, oh yeah, that's a beneficial use. You also have to use it conservatively. So if you have this is a true story, if you have a goat that's on a parcel that's 300 feet away from the river, you can't flood irrigate the entire 300 feet so that you have drinking water for your goat. That's not a conservative use. That's not a reasonable use. That's the other part. You have to use it reasonably. It has to make sense. Now, the trick is that what does maximum beneficial use mean? What does conservative water use mean? What does reasonable use mean? That depends on the community in which the water is located. It depends on the people who are using the water, and it depends on the time in which that water is being used. Things change. And society's construct for what reasonableness means also can change over time. That being said, the courts have taken a very, very pro-water user stance and have been very reluctant to wade into any kind of really forceful mechanism by which the state can take back water. So a property owner's right is still very strong. If you can show that you're reasonably using it and that you're doing it to beneficially use it, that's a pretty strong right, and the courts are going to be very reluctant to intercede or interfere with that. What are the different types of water rights? Add into that kind of construct, there's a lot of different types of water rights, and they're very confusing. Each one of them has a slightly different flavor, a slightly different set of court prerequisites and court findings. Added to that, California actually has a dual water rights system. We're the only state in the nation that does that. Whether for better or worse, we can talk about that perhaps offline, but we have what's called a kind of common law English approach, which is if I'm next to a river and my property touches the river, I have the right to use a reasonable amount of water from that river. I also then have a first in time, first in right approach. That's kind of an appropriative right. If I've gotten in line first and I'm taking that water, then people who come after me have to get in line and are subject to my needs first. So if I look at all the different types, I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have pre-14 appropriative. The water board has very little regulatory authority over those. Those were basically the gold rushers who came out there and were using water for placer gold mining and staked a sign and said, I, under this water company, have a right to use this much water. We still honor those claims today. That's the riparian piece. This, if I'm next to it, then I get a reasonable share of that river. Something called the Pueblo right, related to the initial Spanish missionaries who came up and down the state. There are only 2 Pueblo rights in the entire state, although others have claimed them. They haven't been able to show that they actually have them. There's also adjudicated, people who have gone to the court and actually had a court or the water board come in and actually lay out and say, all right, this is how it's going to work and this is what you get. Post-14 appropriative rights, those are the ones that the board actually issues permits for and reviews and maintains and oversees. And the reason that we divide that between post-14 and pre-14, our water right law system was actually passed in 1913. It was litigated and it didn't go into effect until 1914. So everything that was there before 1914 was grandfathered into place. The board and its predecessors didn't have control or oversight. Everything that comes after that now has to come to the board for a permit. There's also federal reserved, so Indian tribes or perhaps military reservations. These are kind of federal preemptive rights that can supersede state. And then there's overlying groundwater. Now, overlying groundwater is not really a specific designated kind of right, but at the same time, it kind of is. It's one of these things that before the passage of signal was really out of sight, out of mind. The board does not have regulatory authority over pumping groundwater. Locals can, counties can, cities can, irrigation districts can. They have to exercise their own police authority to exercise that right. But the board does not have that authority in the water code. There's a little small sliver for something called subterranean streams. I'm never going to use that word again, and you should just forget that it ever exists because it's a legal fiction. It doesn't exist in real, anyway. So, how does SGWA fit into this? That's the missing connection piece between groundwater. So for 150 years prior to 2014, we really didn't have any management or oversight over groundwater extractions. And in some places that wasn't a big deal because either there was recharge every year and it filled up your groundwater basins, or maybe just people didn't really want anyone to look. But all of a sudden in the drought, we started noticing that, hey, there's hundreds or maybe even thousands of private domestic wells that are going dry. That the well that I'm drilling that used to go down 300 feet, I'm now drilling to 3,000 feet in Tulare County. That kind of continued approach was not sustainable. It wasn't going to work, and if we valued agriculture, if we valued the lifestyles of not just agriculture, but everywhere in California, we needed to develop a system that actually charged the people of the state of California with the directive to actually figure out how they're going to manage their supplies so that you just don't have a race to the bottom. Because ultimately that's what would have happened. You would have depleted your entire aquifer and there would have been nothing left. So SMGWA steps in 2014, first time after 100 years, when in 1914 we had our first set of water right laws, and 100 years later we get groundwater added to it. But it's a very different flavor of groundwater, or it's a very different flavor of water right. Like a lot of, if you typically think of a regulatory agency, what do? Well, we tell people what they can or cannot do, right? There's a water quality standard. You shall not exceed this water quality standard. You shall not take too much water. SMGWA flips that around. It actually charges the local entities who are directly overseeing that groundwater to figure it out on their own and to tell the state, this is what we think is locally important and this is what we think is sustainable and reasonable and the best path forward. SMGWA is also unique in that it adds something called the public trust directly to the kind of charge that the locals have. What is the public trust? It's basically this overarching concept that there are certain things that can't advocate for themselves, mainly the environment, right? The fish don't have the power to advocate for themselves. And so it's actually in the state's interest, it's actually in the people of the state's interest to look at these things and say it's not just agricultural use, it's not just municipal use, it's not just private domestic use, but there is a public trust in maintaining the fish, the air, the waterways, the forests throughout the entire state. SMGWA directly integrates that into law by requiring GSPs to look at depletions of interconnected surface water. It's a first for, I think, any of the state laws directly dealing with water or groundwater. And so as you go forward, you're going to have to figure out how to look at that interconnectedness in a really close way. It's lost on a lot of people that if I have a well and I'm pumping it, ultimately I'm actually depleting the flow from the surface of a stream. And that's kind of a really hard thing to understand. You see, I'm 1,000 feet away. How could I be affecting this surface water flow? But all that water that flows eventually percolates to the surface in a stream and flows downstream. And if you're taking that water and you're using it, you're ultimately depleting the flow of that stream. And so that's what this interconnected surface water element asks you to look at. So what are the solutions? What do you do as you go forward? There are a couple of things that you're going to have to consider when you put together your plan. You're going to have to look at whether or not you want, and maybe I'll start at the bottom, do you want new water? What is new water? Well, it's a source that's not there. It could come from a new reservoir. It could come from groundwater banking. It could come from conservation, which the people of this county have done an absolutely tremendous job of over the last couple of years. You could look at better data. Maybe there's ways where you could exercise different timing if you're pumping during the winter but not during the summer, moving things to storage, if you can kind of maximize efficiencies within the system itself. You could look at pumping restrictions. So you could pass a local ordinance or a county ordinance that says there shall not be any new wells in this county for the time going forward. You could look at land use changes. You could extinguish agriculture or municipal use or industrial use through your zoning restrictions and the existing authorities that the counties already have. Or you could look at developing a new project, whether again it's a dam or desal or a bunch of different things, and figure out where you want to put your effort and your time into. I'm not advocating for any of those, but I want to lay them on the table as things that you're going to have to think about. What are your options and what do you want to do? And so as you look for balancing the basin, you can think about physical solutions, capturing stormwater, maybe tapping into the state water project or other imported water sources, looking at conservation, maximizing new water there, looking at desalination. These are all things that people have talked about in Santa Cruz County. Or you can look at demand management, pumping restrictions, no growth, land retirement, but if you balance them in too far of a direction, you'll tilt the scale one way or the other. Again, that's not to advocate for anything, but just consider what your options are as you go forward. And so I want to leave you with this question, if I can wax philosophical for a little bit. Every basin that I've been to in the last 5 years says we're unique. There's no other basin like us. And to a degree, that's true. But if you look at those forcing mechanisms that I talked about up front, land use changes, population, climate change, those are going to affect everybody. And they are affecting everybody. And so, in some sense, you're not that unique. I hate to tell you. But, I always leave them with a but. There is a unique aspect to each one of those basins, and that's the people who live there. And so the question then is, what do those people in each one of those basins or cities or towns value? What are your values? And this gets back to the value-based management approach. Sure, you can look at value in terms of cost. How much is this going to cost me? I'm a ratepayer. It's going to double or triple my rates. But what do I value as a community? Is it agriculture? Is it municipal growth? Is it something else? You can value more than one thing at one time. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a better person if you value something over something else. And so the challenge for each and every one of you is to create a community that reflects those values that you commonly understand, to understand what those values are, and then create a groundwater sustainability plan that reflects those values to the best of your ability. You're not going to make everyone happy, and you're going to have to choose. You're going to have to choose something over the other. And that's going to be really hard. It's going to be really tough. But if you have meetings like this and you reach out to other stakeholders and you talk to one another and better understand what those values are, that is your only reasonable chance of success going forward. And so I think you're doing a great job, and I'm really thrilled to see what you're doing and to see where you go. With that, thank you.
So you can see my colleagues are moving around the room to gather up some question cards, and Eric, actually, you know what? We have some cards coming in? Okay, great. We'll do that then. So Eric, actually, I'm going to ask you to come on back up here if you could. Sorry. So we'll have you, I'll read the cards. So I'll read the cards from down there, and Eric will, just like we've done in the past, I'll get through as many as we can and go ahead and let Eric field them. So. Okay. And I'll need that one. Thank you. Are we on? We're on. Okay, good. Okay. Sorry, Eric.
It's never good when the first response after your speech is for someone to giggle.
Years from now, we'll look back on this and laugh, I'm sure. Eric, why does it take so many years to get any action on the part of the Regional Water Quality Control Board?
So,
you see how he didn't pause? That's how smooth Eric is.
I can't speak directly for the regional board, but it depends what you're asking them to do. The way the water code is set up, and I hate to just blame the water code, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that you have a really strong private property kind of interest, and the courts have repeatedly reaffirmed that private property interest, and so it's very difficult for the board to develop any kind of case, enforcement action, or even kind of regulatory program if it doesn't do a lot of work up front. Part of that is CEQA. We have to do a very complex CEQA analysis. We get sued on almost every single CEQA document, and so we just have to make sure that we put our ducks in a row. We still do those CEQA documents, but it takes us a while to do them. There's response to comments, and then it gets back to, again, that value proposition. So if we come up with a regulation and it's not something that the people of the valley or the region want or value, then it's unlikely that that regulation is going to go forward. So part of it is being able to integrate stakeholder comments and trying to figure out what the stakeholders are looking for, well balanced with the set of regulatory requirements that are set out in the water code.
Okay. Well, sorry. How are pre-1914 rights passed down? Can they be sold? Can they be challenged using public trust doctrine?
So pre-14 rights can be sold. Typically they're associated with either, let's say, a set of property or, a water district or whoever owns them. It could be a person. Yes, they basically are passed down like a title. They go with the property that they're typically attached to. They can be challenged. They can be challenged on a number of fronts. Again, the board has very little regulatory authority over pre-14 rights, to the extent where we have been challenged when we even ask people to verify that they have a pre-14 right. Now we think that we can go forward doing that, but we had to go to court to even ask that. And that hasn't been asked for a lot of pre-14 rights. They haven't been verified. Local suits, local citizen directives can petition the courts to verify that. They can petition the board to verify that. It's not a fast process, but it can be done.
Will the state ever charge for capturing water like Washington State does?
It depends what you mean by capturing water. So we already do charge for capturing water. I hate to tell people that, but it's true. That's how the state board pays its staff. There is 2 fees that we assess on post-14 water right holders. There's an application fee. So when you come in and you say, here's my application, I want to take 10,000 acre feet, there's a flat fee, and then we charge you by the acre foot for every value over, I think it's 100 acre feet. Then every year after that, we also assess you a fee for the value of that permit. Now, that's true for post-14 appropriative rights. It's true for nobody else.
Hold on. What is the state's top priority for managing groundwater?
The state's top priority for managing groundwater is to see SGMA successfully implemented. It's hard to go from 0 to 100 in a year or two. And so it's hard to go from no groundwater management from 1914 to 2014 and then expect all of a sudden overnight for everybody to suddenly understand exactly how their basin works, exactly how to manage groundwater basin. And it's not very reasonable for the state to think that they could do that either. It's a complicated process. You typically need a lot of data. You have to know where your wells are. You have to know what the water is being used for. Putting all that together takes time. And that's the reason SGMA was written the way that it was. 5 or 7 years to kind of put your plans together, 20 years to implement them, realizing that none of this is going to turn around overnight. And so I think our top priority is being able to work with local entities, work with local stakeholders and groundwater users to figure out what we can do to make SGMA successful. The Department of Water Resources has developed a tremendous number of technical tools. Those are available on its website, and they're continuing to do that. The board has a somewhat different role where we don't really come in until somebody messes up. And so our role has kind of been reminding people, hey, you really don't want to mess up because then we're going to come in and manage your groundwater for you. And that's been a pretty scary proposition for many people. And maybe rightly so, because we don't have to take 20 years to manage the groundwater. We could do it more quickly. We could do it more draconianly and more expensively. So we kind of remind people of this, that, hey, it's worth your time and effort to have meetings like this and try and work things out, because we can come in and work things out for you, but nobody's going to like it.
Okay, I'm behind you.
Okay. Cool. Very good.
All right, big hand for
Thank you.